Honey, first class is for ticketed passengers. Economy is down that way.
You do not belong here. This section is for first-class passengers only.
Is this your first time flying with us? The flight attendant asked, her tone a mix of forced politeness and subtle judgment. Amara didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded, taking in the familiar scent of high-end leather and polished metal that filled the cabin. Her eyes flicked to the window, noting the sun beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow through the jet's windows. The flight attendant stood with her arms crossed, waiting for an answer, her stance demanding a quick response. "You'll need to sit in your assigned seat," the attendant continued, her words tinged with an impatience she wasn't bothering to hide. "The boarding process is a little more formal here. We wouldn't want to cause any delays." Amara gave a brief glance at the flight attendant before walking slowly toward her seat. The flight attendant's gaze followed her with subtle scrutiny, clearly unimpressed by the way Amara moved. Unhurried, calm, and collected. When Amara reached her seat, the flight attendant was already standing beside her, the condescension never fully leaving her tone. "Are you sure you're in the right seat? I'll double-check your ticket." "I wouldn't want to make a mistake," the flight attendant said, her voice higher than usual, as if Amara's presence was an inconvenience. She leaned over slightly, peering down at Amara's boarding pass with a touch too much scrutiny, as though she doubted the validity of Amara's reservation. Amara didn't flinch. She maintained her composure, her fingers tightening slightly around the armrest as she slowly turned her attention to the flight attendant. "I'm certain I'm in the right seat," Amara replied smoothly, her voice low but firm. There was a quiet strength in her words, an underlying confidence that contrasted sharply with the flight attendant's dismissive air. "You can go ahead and check, but I'm sure it's fine." The flight attendant's eyes flickered briefly to Amara's face, scanning her for any hint of defiance. When she saw none, she straightened up, though her lips pressed together in an annoyed line. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely above a whisper, but Amara caught the faint edge of distaste in it. As the attendant walked away, Amara sat back in her seat. The noise of the other passengers settled into a dull hum around her. She adjusted the seatbelt across her lap, her movements composed, her face neutral. She had been through this kind of prejudice before, but there was something about the flight attendant's dismissiveness that made it more pronounced in this moment. The attendant, clearly not used to being ignored or challenged, returned with a slight huff, her footsteps louder than necessary as she stopped next to Amara's seat again. "You're lucky this is first class," the flight attendant said, her tone now laced with a patronizing edge. "People like you tend to forget their place. We offer only the best for those who can afford it." Amara didn't answer right away. She turned her head slightly, giving the flight attendant a measured look. Then, with deliberate calm, she replied, "My place is wherever I choose it to be. It doesn't depend on your opinion." The flight attendant's face flushed slightly, though she tried to hide it behind an insincere smile. "Of course, ma'am. I'm just doing my job. Nothing personal," she said, though the implication of her words was clear. "I'm sure it's not," Amara said quietly, her words laced with a hint of finality. The attendant hesitated, clearly caught between maintaining her composure and the subtle discomfort Amara's response caused. She took a step back, her posture rigid, but her eyes flicked back to Amara once more, lingering a bit too long. Her gaze betrayed a mix of suspicion and arrogance, as if she was testing Amara, trying to see if she would react. Amara didn't budge. Her calm, unwavering gaze met the flight attendant's, and for a brief moment, there was a quiet tension hanging in the air between them. The flight attendant shifted uneasily, her discomfort palpable now. Finally, she turned, her steps hurried as she walked back down the aisle. The other passengers, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding, continued with their own conversations, some casting curious glances towards Amara, though none dared to speak. Amara let out a soft breath, her focus shifting to the view outside the window. The golden light of the setting sun had given way to a soft orange glow, the sky stretching endlessly ahead of them. For a moment, everything was still. The tension inside the cabin remained thick, but Amara remained unfazed. The flight attendant, unaware of the storm she had unwittingly provoked, continued her rounds, moving from one passenger to the next. But Amara's eyes never left the horizon. She wasn't bothered by the treatment. She simply knew that this was only the beginning. Amara settled back into her seat, the hum of the jet's engines filling the air as the flight attendant walked past, her heels clicking sharply against the cabin's polished floor. Amara's eyes remained fixed on the window, but the flight attendant's presence didn't go unnoticed. The woman's gaze lingered a little too long, as if she was still assessing Amara's right to be there. A few moments passed before the flight attendant returned, this time with an air of self-importance. She stopped beside Amara's seat, her lips curving into a tight, almost forced smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her voice tinged with thinly veiled condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right seat? The number on your boarding pass doesn't quite match the one you're sitting in." Amara turned her head slowly, meeting the attendant's gaze with quiet defiance. The question hung in the air like a challenge, but Amara's response was calm, her voice unwavering. "I'm certain," she replied, her tone smooth and measured. There was no panic, no defensiveness in her words, just confidence. "You can double-check if you'd like, but I assure you this is my seat." The attendant's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Amara's every movement. She wasn't used to being met with such poise, especially not when she had the upper hand, or at least she thought she did. There was a slight shift in the attendant's posture, a subtle tightening of her shoulders as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Very well," the flight attendant muttered, stepping back. But she didn't go far. She stood at a distance, arms crossed, watching Amara intently. It was as if she was daring Amara to challenge her once again. Amara's gaze flicked back to the window, her expression impassive. The flight attendant's actions spoke louder than her words. Each glance, each movement carried an unspoken message, a reminder that despite the luxury around them, Amara was still seen as other, as someone who didn't quite belong. The next few minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of passengers around them. But the atmosphere had changed. Amara could feel it. The flight attendant's hostility was palpable, now that her initial assumptions had been questioned. Without warning, the attendant returned, her movements more deliberate this time. She loomed over Amara's seat, almost daring her to make a move. "You know, it's quite rare that someone of your background would be flying this class," the attendant remarked, her voice now openly condescending. She leaned in, her breath barely audible but sharp with disdain. "Are you sure you're not just here for a free ride?" Amara's eyes shifted back to the attendant, her expression unreadable. The words stung, but she didn't let it show. She met the attendant's gaze, her posture unchanged. "I'm here because I belong here," Amara said quietly, her voice now taking on a firmness that echoed through the tension-filled space. "And as for the rest of it, that's none of your business." The attendant's lips curled into a sneer, but she didn't press further. Instead, she straightened up, looking down her nose at Amara as though she had just been handed a lesson in manners. But it wasn't a lesson the attendant was ready to learn. She huffed, glancing over Amara's shoulder and then back at her, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. The words she had spoken, the bias she had revealed, none of it was sitting well with her. She knew she had crossed a line, but her pride wouldn't allow her to retreat. She had to stand her ground. "I'll let you be then," the flight attendant muttered, her voice still dripping with thinly veiled contempt. "But don't think I won't be keeping an eye on you. You're not above the rules, no matter who you are." Amara didn't respond, not verbally, but her stance spoke volumes. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to the challenge. She simply sat still, her eyes fixed on the horizon outside the window. There was no need for words. The flight attendant had already revealed herself. Amara knew exactly where she stood, both literally and figuratively. As the attendant walked away, her steps were quick, almost agitated, as if she couldn't leave fast enough. The other passengers, who had been oblivious to the exchange, began to take notice. Their eyes flicked between Amara and the attendant, the air now thick with the unspoken tension. Amara's calm demeanor remained unshaken, but the flight attendant's behavior was a stark reminder of the prejudice that still simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about assumptions, about the way society still judged people based on their appearance, their race. The jet continued its steady course through the sky, the rhythmic hum of the engines providing a steady backdrop to the chaos just beneath the surface. The passengers were oblivious, but Amara knew the flight was just the beginning. She glanced around the cabin, her eyes sweeping over the other passengers. Some were engrossed in their own conversations, others buried in their screens. But there were a few who had caught the exchange, their curious glances lingering on her. She could almost feel their judgment, though none of them dared to speak up. Her focus shifted back to the front of the cabin, where the flight attendant stood, her arms still crossed, her posture rigid. The tension between them remained, but Amara wasn't concerned. In fact, it was clear to her now that the real confrontation hadn't even started yet. The jet continued its flight, but in the quiet tension of the cabin, something was about to change. Amara knew that this was only the beginning, that the world would soon learn the consequences of underestimating her. But for now, she remained silent, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. The soft murmur of conversation filled the air, but Amara remained an island of silence in the luxurious cabin. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, her back straight, her demeanor as composed as ever. She glanced once more out the window, watching the endless sky stretch ahead, untouched by the tension building within the jet. The flight attendant approached again, this time with a forced smile plastered on her face. Her steps were louder, more deliberate than before. She stopped a few feet from Amara, eyes narrowing as she took in the stillness of the woman before her. So calm, so unfazed. The attendant could feel her growing discomfort. She had already underestimated Amara once, but now her patience was wearing thin. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice tight, trying to mask the underlying irritation. "But I have to insist that you comply with the safety regulations. You'll need to fasten your seatbelt. We're about to reach cruising altitude." Amara didn't look up immediately. Her gaze remained fixed outside the window, as if the request was of little consequence. After a long pause, Amara's voice broke the silence, smooth and unhurried. "I don't have to prove anything to you," she said calmly, her words piercing the tension like a sharp, deliberate strike. "Just do your job, and I'll do mine." The flight attendant flinched, momentarily taken aback. It wasn't the response she expected, and certainly not the response she had hoped for. She was used to having control, to exerting her authority over passengers, especially those who seemed out of place in a setting like this. But Amara's response was cool, collected. There was no anger, no resistance, just an undeniable command of the situation. The attendant blinked, her lips pressing into a thin line as if weighing how to respond, but she remained silent, her eyes flickering toward the seatbelt sign before returning to Amara's unwavering gaze. She opened her mouth, but then hesitated, unwilling to further escalate the tension. Instead, she simply nodded curtly. "Very well, ma'am," she said, her voice slightly more strained now. "Please make sure you're secured properly. It's for your own safety." Amara nodded once, not out of submission, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the flight attendant's demand. She continued to sit calmly, her posture perfect, exuding a quiet confidence that couldn't be shaken by the attendant's thinly veiled hostility. The attendant hovered for a moment longer, still unsure whether to press the issue, but the growing realization that her words and actions weren't having the desired effect began to settle in. She glanced around the cabin, her gaze momentarily catching the eyes of a few passengers. A few had noticed the exchange, though most remained absorbed in their own worlds. The tension in the air seemed to thicken, but no one spoke up. No one intervened. The flight attendant's gaze lingered a little longer on Amara, assessing her, trying to figure out just who this woman was. Something in Amara's stillness, her elegance, hinted at something far beyond what the attendant could see. It was in the way she sat, the way her every movement was measured and deliberate. Amara's demeanor wasn't that of someone who needed to prove herself. It was the quiet confidence of someone who already knew exactly who they were. Without another word, the flight attendant straightened up and moved toward the front of the cabin, her footsteps sharp and tense. The conversation died, but the weight of it hung in the air. The passengers who had been observing the exchange looked away quickly, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The cabin returned to its previous hum, but something had shifted. Amara didn't glance after the flight attendant. She didn't need to. She knew that the power of the moment had already been established. It was subtle, nothing overt, nothing flashy, but the shift was undeniable. The flight attendant's assumption that she could control Amara, that she could dismiss her with an offhand remark, had been shattered in a few simple words. As the minutes passed, the air in the cabin seemed to lighten slightly, the tension dissipating as passengers relaxed back into their seats. But Amara's quiet presence remained a steady undercurrent, the calm at the eye of the storm. A few moments later, the seatbelt sign illuminated. Passengers dutifully clicked their belts into place. Amara remained perfectly still, as if the subtle clash had never even occurred. Her gaze remained fixed out the window, her mind now far from the mundane conflict of the cabin. The flight attendant returned to the front of the jet, her movements still stiff, as if she were now more aware of the quiet strength in the woman she had just tried to intimidate. She tried to shake off the feeling of having misjudged Amara, but the nagging uncertainty lingered. Meanwhile, Amara's posture remained unshaken. She wasn't concerned with the flight attendant's discomfort, nor with the silent observations of the passengers around her. In her own quiet way, she had already won. The flight attendant didn't know it yet, but Amara wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was the force that would change the course of their entire journey. The cabin was quieter now, the jet cruising smoothly through the sky. The flight attendant, still holding on to the discomfort she had felt earlier, passed by Amara's seat again, this time with a renewed sense of tension in her movements. Her footsteps were lighter, almost hesitant, as if she knew her actions had been crossing an invisible line, yet she could not let it go. Amara remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture impeccable. The tension between them hadn't fully subsided, and both of them felt it hanging in the air, thick and heavy. She could sense the flight attendant's eyes on her again, and though she hadn't said a word, the challenge was there, unspoken. Without warning, the flight attendant stopped next to Amara once more, her face tight with frustration. There was no longer the pretension of politeness. This time, her words came with a sharp edge. "I've had enough of your attitude," the flight attendant snapped, her tone hardening. She reached down to grab Amara's arm, a physical move to assert her dominance in a way she hadn't before. The force with which her hand wrapped around Amara's wrist was jarring, the grip too tight, too demanding. The moment the flight attendant made contact, a quiet stillness filled the cabin. The other passengers looked up from their books or screens, sensing that something was about to unfold. Some looked away, uncomfortable, but none dared to intervene. Amara's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened, and for a brief moment, the flight attendant felt a shift in the air, as if the balance of power had just tipped. "Let go of me," Amara said, her voice low, but the command in it was undeniable. The flight attendant hesitated, her grip tightening for a moment before her fingers loosened in confusion. She hadn't expected this response. No anger, no fear, just calm. That was something she couldn't process. Amara stood slowly, her height towering over the flight attendant. She didn't flinch, didn't move quickly. She simply straightened herself, as though she was finally ready to address the flight attendant in a way that made the room listen. "Do you know who I am?" Amara's voice rang out, cool but full of authority. The flight attendant's confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" she asked, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Her posture shifted again, her earlier confidence beginning to unravel as she realized the dynamics were shifting in a way she didn't understand. Amara's lips curled into a small, calculated smile. She took a step closer to the flight attendant, the room around them falling into an unnatural silence. The passengers watched closely now, their eyes darting between the two women. "You've just slapped the wrong person," Amara said, her voice unwavering. "I own this plane." The words landed like a punch, a shockwave rippling through the cabin. The flight attendant's face drained of color, her eyes widening in disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. The humiliation was immediate, and it washed over her like a cold tide. I'm sorry, I didn't," she stammered, her eyes darting to the other passengers, all of whom had now shifted in their seats, watching the confrontation unfold. "I didn't know. I didn't." Amara held up her hand, silencing the flight attendant. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Your apology is meaningless," Amara said, her voice cutting through the air. "The moment you decided to put your hands on me, you made a mistake. And now, you'll face the consequences." The flight attendant's face flushed, her hands trembling. She looked around hoping for someone to intervene, but the passengers, all of them, sat back, not a single person offering support. They had witnessed the power shift. Amara's calm was so commanding that none of them could think of stepping in. She took a slow, deliberate step back, her eyes still locked on the flight attendant. "You're fired," Amara said simply, each word punctuated with finality, effective immediately. The flight attendant stumbled back, unable to process the weight of Amara's words. She had expected resistance, maybe a confrontation, but she never imagined this. The power she had tried to wield over Amara had crumbled in an instant. The jet she had once seen as hers to control was no longer hers to command. "Please," the flight attendant whispered, her voice desperate now, but it was clear to everyone in the cabin that her authority had been stripped away. I didn't mean any harm." Amara stood firm, her gaze unwavering. "It's too late for that." She turned toward the cabin, her back straight, and began walking toward the front of the jet. The flight attendant, now reduced to a shell of her previous confidence, stood frozen in place. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some of them now pitying her, others simply silent. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as Amara's footsteps echoed softly in the air, her presence still commanding the space. As she reached the front of the jet, she spoke to the captain, her words simple but clear. "The flight attendant is no longer working today," Amara stated. "I trust you'll handle this properly." The captain nodded, his face grim but understanding. He hadn't known the full details, but he knew enough to see the situation for what it was. Amara had spoken, and her word was final. The jet continued on its path, but the air in the cabin had changed. It was no longer the place where the flight attendant had reigned. It was Amara's now, and everyone knew it. The jet cruised through the sky, the hum of the engines filling the space. But inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. The flight attendant, now standing near the front, was still recovering from the shock of Amara's revelation. Her earlier bravado had been completely dismantled. She stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The realization of who Amara really was had left her stunned, a cold sweat beating on her forehead. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional sound of the stewardess's heels clicking against the floor as they moved about. Most passengers were too nervous to make eye contact, and some subtly turned their heads, pretending not to notice the confrontation that had taken center stage. But the tension was undeniable. The flight attendant's usual confidence had dissolved, leaving only vulnerability in its place. Amara stood near the front, waiting for the moment when the flight attendant would make her move. The shift in power was clear to everyone around. Amara had already taken control, and the room was now hers. The flight attendant finally took a step forward, her hands shaking slightly as she approached. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously across the passengers who were now watching the exchange with bated breath. I never meant to insult you," the flight attendant stammered, her words a mix of guilt and disbelief. I didn't know who you were." Her voice wavered as she looked down at the floor, unable to meet Amara's unblinking gaze. Amara's expression remained calm, but there was a fire in her eyes that was impossible to ignore. She straightened, standing tall, her posture radiating the quiet authority that had already shaken the flight attendant to her core. "You didn't need to know," Amara said evenly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "It wasn't about who I am. It was about how you treated me. It was about how you treated people like me." The flight attendant winced at the words. She had heard them before, used them herself even, when dismissing others, people of color, people she thought didn't belong in spaces like this. But hearing them now, directed at her, was like a slap to the face. The weight of Amara's words settled into her chest, and she found herself stumbling for an apology that seemed hollow, meaningless. I didn't," the flight attendant began, but her voice faltered. Amara's calm voice stopped her mid-sentence. "No, you didn't," Amara replied sharply, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You assumed I didn't belong here. You assumed my place was beneath you." The flight attendant's face flushed a deep red. She had been so sure of her position, so certain that her authority as a flight attendant could never be challenged. But here she was, standing before a woman she had tried to belittle, now fully aware of her own misplaced power. The realization hit harder than anything she had expected. "Don't mistake kindness for weakness," Amara said, her voice firm, the words carrying the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. It wasn't just a warning. It was a lesson, one that the flight attendant wouldn't soon forget. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as if everyone had been holding their breath. The flight attendant blinked rapidly, her face now pale. She had crossed a line, and now the consequences were crashing down around her. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, the weight of their silent judgment. I didn't mean to," she started again, but Amara cut her off. "Enough," Amara said, her tone leaving no room for further apology or excuses. "You've lost your job. You've lost the respect you thought you had, and now you've lost any chance of dignity in this cabin. You'll never be the same after this. You should leave." The flight attendant stood motionless, her mouth agape as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She had hoped, perhaps, that her apologies could smooth things over, that she could regain some semblance of control over the situation, but Amara wasn't having it. The power she had wielded earlier was now fully hers. Without another word, Amara turned to the captain, her back straight, her movements graceful but assertive. "Please have her removed from service," she said, her voice quiet but clear, the request carrying the weight of authority. "I'll take care of the rest." The captain, who had been watching from the cockpit, nodded solemnly. He hadn't known the full extent of the situation, but now it was clear. Amara had spoken, and it was final. As the captain made his way toward the flight attendant, she didn't protest, didn't argue. She was defeated, and the realization that her actions had led to this was too much to bear. She followed the captain out of the cabin, her head hanging low, her body tense with the sting of humiliation. Amara remained standing near the front, her posture unwavering. She didn't look back at the flight attendant, but the others in the cabin watched her closely. They had seen the power shift, and they knew that this wasn't just a confrontation. It was a lesson, one that would leave its mark on everyone who had witnessed it. As the door closed behind the flight attendant, Amara stood silently for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the cabin. There was no triumph in her expression, no gloating, just a quiet certainty that what had just happened was necessary, and the passengers knew it too. They had just witnessed something rare, a powerful moment of justice, delivered with grace and strength. The jet continued its smooth flight, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had changed completely. The flight attendant, once the authority figure in the space, was now being escorted out of the cabin by the captain, her shoulders slumped and her face pale with the weight of her actions. She had been given no chance to explain, no opportunity to redeem herself. The power she had once commanded had evaporated in the wake of Amara's quiet, decisive authority. Amara stood at the front of the cabin, her posture unshaken, her presence still commanding. She watched as the flight attendant disappeared into the galley area with the captain, then turned her attention to the other passengers, who were now watching her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The jet was still on course, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop to the charged silence in the cabin. Amara moved gracefully toward her seat, her steps calm but deliberate. As she passed by the rows of passengers, some of them tried to look away, their faces red with discomfort, while others watched her with a newfound respect. Amara settled back into her seat and quietly unbuckled her seatbelt, signaling to the flight attendants who had been serving drinks further down the cabin. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. She didn't need to raise her voice. The power in the room had already shifted. What had begun as a moment of conflict was now a decisive, final act of control. The phone call was brief, purposeful. Amara dialed a number, her fingers moving with practiced precision. She spoke calmly, but with authority, her voice steady as she made the request. "Hello, this is Amara Lewis. I need to ensure that the flight attendant who was just escorted off my plane is immediately removed from service," she said, the words carrying a weight that demanded immediate action. "I've already spoken to the captain. Please ensure she's permanently removed from all future duties on this flight, and that she's appropriately dealt with by your company." Her voice was cool, professional, nothing emotional, nothing personal. The call was about business, about ensuring that what had happened wasn't just overlooked or dismissed. It was about holding someone accountable for their actions. The conversation lasted only a few moments, but the impact of it was felt immediately. As she ended the call, she put the phone back into her bag and sat back, waiting, calm in her silence. She didn't need to say anything more. Her actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The flight attendants, who had been quietly serving drinks, now seemed to take notice of her as well. They moved with a different air about them, a respect that hadn't been there before. They were professionals, yes, but they had seen the power dynamics shift. Amara wasn't just another passenger. She was someone who had taken control of a situation that could have easily spiraled out of control. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the cabin began to change. Passengers who had been silent before were now murmuring softly among themselves. Some glanced at Amara, but there was a hesitation in their eyes now, an understanding that the reality of the situation was far more complex than they had originally thought. The flight attendant's behavior had been wrong, and they had all seen it unfold. It was clear now that Amara had done what needed to be done, and she had done it with a dignity that left no room for question. Amara didn't look at the passengers. She didn't need to. Her calmness, her ability to take control without raising her voice, had already left its mark. It wasn't just about her being a billionaire. It was about the way she had handled the situation with grace and authority, without a single ounce of aggression or anger. The murmurs among the passengers grew as the flight attendants quietly took their places. The cabin was no longer just a place of luxury. It had become a space where a deeper truth was being acknowledged. The reality of systemic prejudice had been exposed, not in a dramatic, fiery confrontation, but in the quiet strength of one woman's refusal to tolerate disrespect. Some of the passengers now looked at Amara differently. She wasn't just the woman they had assumed to be an affluent, quiet passenger. She was a force, and they understood that now. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. The flight attendants who had been complicit in this system of oppression, whether knowingly or not, could no longer ignore the truth. They were part of the system that had allowed such treatment to continue unchecked, but now they were faced with the consequences of their actions. Amara didn't need to hear the whispers. She didn't need validation from anyone else. The flight attendant had been removed from duty, and the message had been sent. That kind of behavior would not be tolerated. As the jet began its descent toward its destination, the passengers sat a little straighter, the cabin a little quieter, as if everyone was taking a moment to reflect on the shift that had just taken place. The story of Amara's strength and dignity was one they would carry with them long after the jet descended smoothly toward its destination. But inside the cabin, a palpable shift had occurred. The usual murmur of conversations was replaced by an uneasy quiet, as the passengers seemed to digest what had just transpired. What had started as a simple flight had turned into a lesson on power, dignity, and justice. Amara sat near the front, her gaze out the window, her face calm but thoughtful. She didn't need to look around to know that the atmosphere had changed. The flight attendant who had once held authority in this space was gone, her removal leaving a void that was now filled with the subtle tension of reflection. The passengers, many of whom had been oblivious to the dynamics of power in the cabin, were now left to reckon with their own complicity in an unequal system. A conversation between two passengers seated across the aisle from one another broke the silence. "Did you see that?" one of them whispered, her voice a little shaky, as if the events of the past few hours had left her rattled. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. She just showed them.
Amara stood at the front of the cabin, her posture unshaken, her presence still commanding. She watched as the flight attendant disappeared into the galley area with the captain, then turned her attention to the other passengers, who were now watching her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The jet was still on course, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop to the charged silence in the cabin. Amara moved gracefully toward her seat, her steps calm but deliberate. As she passed by the rows of passengers, some of them tried to look away, their faces red with discomfort, while others watched her with a newfound respect. Amara settled back into her seat and quietly unbuckled her seatbelt, signaling to the flight attendants who had been serving drinks further down the cabin. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. She didn't need to raise her voice. The power in the room had already shifted. What had begun as a moment of conflict was now a decisive final act of control. The phone call was brief, purposeful. Amara dialed a number, her fingers moving with practiced precision. She spoke calmly, but with authority, her voice steady as she made the request. "Hello, this is Amara Lewis. I need to ensure that the flight attendant who was just escorted off my plane is immediately removed from service," she said, the words carrying a weight that demanded immediate action. "I've already spoken to the captain. Please ensure she's permanently removed from all future duties on this flight, and that she's appropriately dealt with by your company." Her voice was cool, professional, nothing emotional, nothing personal. The call was about business, about ensuring that what had happened wasn't just overlooked or dismissed. It was about holding someone accountable for their actions. The conversation lasted only a few moments, but the impact of it was felt immediately. As she ended the call, she put the phone back into her bag and sat back, waiting, calm in her silence. She didn't need to say anything more. Her actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The flight attendants who had been quietly serving drinks now seemed to take notice of her as well. They moved with a different air about them, a respect that hadn't been there before. They were professionals, yes, but they had seen the power dynamics shift. Amara wasn't just another passenger. She was someone who had taken control of a situation that could have easily spiraled out of control. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the cabin began to change. Passengers who had been silent before were now murmuring softly among themselves. Some glanced at Amara, but there was a hesitation in their eyes now, an understanding that the reality of the situation was far more complex than they had originally thought. The flight attendants' behavior had been wrong, and they had all seen it unfold. It was clear now that Amara had done what needed to be done, and she had done it with a dignity that left no room for question. Amara didn't look at the passengers. She didn't need to. Her calmness, her ability to take control without raising her voice, had already left its mark. It wasn't just about her being a billionaire. It was about the way she had handled the situation with grace and authority, without a single ounce of aggression or anger. The murmurs among the passengers grew as the flight attendants quietly took their places. The cabin was no longer just a place of luxury. It had become a space where a deeper truth was being acknowledged. The reality of systemic prejudice had been exposed, not in a dramatic, fiery confrontation, but in the quiet strength of one woman's refusal to tolerate disrespect. Some of the passengers now looked at Amara differently. She wasn't just the woman they had assumed to be an affluent, quiet passenger. She was a force. And they understood that now. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. The flight attendants, who had been complicit in the system of oppression, whether knowingly or not, could no longer ignore the truth. They were part of the system that had allowed such treatment to continue unchecked. But now, they were faced with the consequences of their actions. Amara didn't need to hear the whispers. She didn't need validation from anyone else. The flight attendant had been removed from duty and the message had been sent. That kind of behavior would not be tolerated. As the jet began its descent toward its destination, the passengers sat a little straighter, the cabin a little quieter, as if everyone was taking a moment to reflect on the shift that had just taken place. The story of Amara's strength and dignity was one they would carry with them long of. The jet descended smoothly toward its destination, but inside the cabin, a palpable shift had occurred. The usual murmur of conversations was replaced by an uneasy quiet as the passengers seemed to digest what had just transpired. What had started as a simple flight had turned into a lesson on power, dignity, and justice. Amara sat near the front, her gaze out the window, her face calm but thoughtful. She didn't need to look around to know that the atmosphere had changed. The flight attendant, who had once held authority in this space, was gone, her removal leaving a void that was now filled with the subtle tension of reflection. The passengers, many of whom had been oblivious to the dynamics of power in the cabin, were now left to reckon with their own complicity in an unequal system. A conversation between two passengers, seated across the aisle from one another, broke the silence. "Did you see that?" one of them whispered, her voice a little shaky, as if the events of the past few hours had left her rattled. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. She just showed them. The other passenger nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the cabin as if still processing the confrontation. It was powerful, so calm, like she knew exactly what she was doing. She did know what she was doing. the first passenger replied, her tone now more reflective. She didn't have to shout. She didn't have to get angry. She just stood there, didn't back down, and made it clear that she wasn't going to let anyone disrespect her. It's like, the second passenger continued, glancing over at Amara. She took control of the entire situation without even raising her voice. She made them face their own behavior. That flight attendant, she thought she had the power, but Amara flipped it. She showed everyone who was in charge. The first passenger leaned in slightly, her voice lowering, as if the weight of the conversation was making her rethink everything. It's kind of humbling, right? We all saw it. We're all so used to letting people like that flight attendant have their way. But Amara, she didn't let it slide. She took control. The second passenger nodded, her expression thoughtful. I never thought about it like that. She made a point to stay calm. That was the strength right there, holding her ground without needing to get loud. The first passenger sat back, glancing over at Amara's still figure. I wonder if we could all do that. Stand up without getting angry, without fighting. Just show them who we are. The second passenger was quiet for a moment before responding. I think we all need to do that more. We let so much slide, don't we? It's not just about fighting back. It's about showing the world that we won't tolerate being treated like that. Amara sat perfectly still, her thoughts her own, but she could hear the faint conversation behind her. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the passengers who were speaking quietly about the events of the flight. Her mind wasn't focused on the moment of confrontation anymore. It was on what would come next. She had taken action, quietly, decisively. But it was clear that the ripple effects of what had happened were far from over. Amara had shown them something simple, but powerful. That injustice, no matter how subtle or systemic, could not go unchecked. And in doing so, she had made her own stand against the inequalities that often went unnoticed in everyday life. As the jet began its final approach, Amara reflected on how easy it had been, in a sense. There had been no shouting, no forceful gestures, just a calm response and the sheer act of not backing down. And in the process, she had not only asserted her own power, but had made those around her confront their own biases. The conversation between the passengers continued in hushed tones, the words floating through the cabin, filling the spaces between the soft hum of the engines. More than one person had witnessed the power shift. More than one person was now thinking about what had just happened, questioning their own assumptions and the systems they were a part of. The seatbelt sign flickered on as the plane began its descent toward the runway, and the cabin slowly came to life again, the tension beginning to ease. But the atmosphere was different now. The passengers had been changed by what they had seen. Some of them, no doubt, would return to their lives, unchanged, unaware of the quiet power of one woman's decision to stand up against injustice. But some would remember. Some would carry this moment with them. The lesson of standing tall in the face of disrespect and the strength that comes with it. As the wheels touched down, Amara allowed herself a moment of reflection. She didn't expect applause, didn't expect gratitude. What she had done wasn't for recognition, it was for the quiet power of doing what was right. And in that moment, she knew that her actions would have a lasting impact, not just on the flight, but on the people who had witnessed. The ripple effect would continue long after the doors of the jet had opened. Amara's calm, dignified resolve had already changed the course of the journey, and she knew that even in the smallest moments, the ripple of standing up against injustice could make waves. The jet glided smoothly toward the runway, the lights of the city twinkling below like scattered stars. Amara gazed out the window, watching the vast expanse of the earth below, her posture as composed as ever. The calm, steady rhythm of the descent seemed to mirror the calm in her own heart. The flight had been more than just a journey across the skies. It had been a powerful statement, a reminder that even the quietest actions could leave ripples in the world. The cabin was still, the hum of the engines and the soft click of seatbelt signs the only sounds filling the space. The passengers had all settled into their seats, the tension from earlier still lingering in the air, but now tempered by a profound silence. Those who had witnessed Amara's actions were left in their own thoughts, some looking out the window, some staring at their hands, the weight of the moment settling on them like a heavy blanket. As the jet touched down with a gentle thud, Amara stood slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. The final descent had been smooth, but it wasn't the landing that held her attention. It was the way her actions had affected the people around her. She had made her statement, and now she would leave it in their hands to decide what they would do with it. Amara walked down the aisle with the same quiet confidence she had maintained throughout the flight. She didn't look to the passengers, didn't acknowledge them. There was no need. The lesson had already been given, and it would be up to them to carry it forward. As she reached the door, she paused for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the handle. She could feel the subtle shift in the air, the respect that had been earned not through words but through action. The passengers had witnessed a change in the power dynamic. They had seen how one woman, through calm resolve, had taken control of a situation that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. They had seen how a single act of defiance against prejudice had forced them to confront their own assumptions, their own complicity. And for some of them, that moment would stay with them for a long time. As the doors of the jet opened and the cool air rushed in, Amara stepped onto the tarmac, the ground beneath her feet steady and firm. The world outside the plane was bustling with the usual noise of a busy airport, but for Amara, the moment felt quieter than ever. She had accomplished what she had set out to do, not with anger, not with noise, but with the quiet strength of standing her ground. Her hand rested at her side, and as she took her first step away from the plane, she allowed herself a small smile. The moment had been about more than just her. It had been about showing those around her that strength wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, the greatest strength came in silence, in the simple act of not letting others dictate your worth. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies in silence, Amara thought, the words echoing softly in her mind. She had fought no battles, raised no fists, but in her own way, she had shifted the course of the flight. She had shown everyone around her the power of standing firm without saying a word. The sound of her heels clicking against the tarmac was the only noise now, and as she walked toward the terminal, her heart was light. She wasn't looking for applause or recognition. She had done what was necessary, and in doing so, had made a quiet but significant impact on the people around her. Behind her, the doors of the plane closed, and the passengers filed off. Some of them glancing around nervously, others simply staring straight ahead. But each one carried with them the memory of what had transpired. The moment they had witnessed was more than just a confrontation. It was a lesson in dignity, in strength, and in the quiet power of standing up for what was right. For Amara, the journey wasn't over. It never really was. But this chapter had ended, and as she disappeared into the crowd of travelers, she knew that, no matter where she went next, she had already planted a seed. A small act of resistance, done with grace, had already begun to ripple out, changing the way people saw the world and their place in it. And as the airport buzzed around her, Amara walked on, confident that her actions had made a difference, not just for herself, but for the people who had witnessed it, however quietly. In the end, it was always about how the world would be shaped by the strength of those who refused to be silent in the face of injustice. As Amara disappeared into the crowd, her quiet strength still resonating in the hearts of those who witnessed, the world around her seemed a little bit different. A single moment, one woman's refusal to stay silent, had shaken the very foundation of the system. Will you stand up too? Will you be the change, the voice that echoes in the silence? Subscribe, now to see how far the ripple effect of one act of courage can go. You won't want to miss what happens next.